Welcome to the podcast about venture capital, where investors and founders alike can learn how VCs make decisions and reach conviction. Your host is Nick Moran, and this is The Full Ratchet.
Welcome to another special release of Investor Stories. On this installment, the experts discuss a startup that they did not invest in, why they passed, and if there was a key learning that now informs their approach. Here's the segment called Why I Passed. On today's special segment, we have Tom Tunguz of Redpoint. Tom, can you tell us a story about a good or a bad pass? A story about a startup that you passed on?
I passed on Pinterest. Ben and I were friends at Google, and we worked together in the same team. And he and I worked together on an initial version. It was called Eat, Drink, Buy, Do, I think. Started a Rails repo, and then I had an opportunity to invest at the Series A and didn't. And I was even a reference for one of the firms that ultimately ended up investing. And that was a huge mistake.
Wow, you were the reference.
Yeah, and Ben's gone on to build an incredible business. And one of the mistakes I've made as a venture capitalist is I wish I had invested in many more of my friends. I think that's wow. I wish I had done that.
Did you get any founder shares or advisory shares for the early help?
No, I have the memory.
And the story. And now we've got it here. On this special segment of Investor Stories, we have Pat Gallagher of Tuesday Capital. Pat, can you tell us a story about a good or a bad pass? A story about a startup that you passed on?
Well, I feel very lucky that we have seen so many exciting companies that we have passed on. I mean, the worst pass, and I was thinking about this, the worst pass has got to be Zoom. I met Eric in September of 2012. Jim Scheinman, who's one of our LPs who runs Maven Ventures now, had introduced me. He said, you got to meet this guy. Eric was ex-Cisco WebEx team, clearly had deep domain expertise. And I was like, but there's alternatives out there right now. Is this really going to be better? That much better, right? Incrementally, this feels like it's going to be better. But and they were raising it like a $20 million valuation on very, very early customer traction. And it was just one of these things where if you step back and sort of take the lens of, I want to bet on entrepreneurs who know markets better than anybody else, who have like a unique insight, that would have been Eric, right? Because clearly he had lived through WebEx and sort of being inside Cisco, and I think saw the opportunity probably better than anybody else. I did not say those words to myself when I met him. I sort of said, interesting product, expensive, right? Expensive is all relative. But we ultimately didn't do it. I mean, and my God, if we'd put $100K in, which is probably the check size we were writing at the time, into that round, it would have returned the fund multiple times. So
whoops.
There's that. Again, we passed on Instacart, we passed on DoorDash, we passed on Flexport, we passed on Robinhood. So I think we had good reasons for all of them at the time, it seemed, but those are all painful misses for sure.
Tough. On today's special segment, we have Trae Vassallo of Defy Partners. Trae, can you tell us a story about a good or a bad pass? A story about a startup that you passed on?
Okay. Let's see. I've got a few. I'll say a quick one is that one of my favorite anti-portfolio passes was I got to meet Ev in the early days of him pitching Twitter. I passed. I just couldn't understand what he was doing. But on the positive, I'm at Trae, which is kind of cool. So not too many people have that. I have a couple of stories about companies I passed on that I'd love to share with entrepreneurs, because I think it's really important that when I'm evaluating a company, I'm not just evaluating the business plan or the product. I am looking at how the character of the people and the culture. And, we touched on this a little bit with kind of going to people's offices and seeing how they interact with their team. But I can think of two companies that I passed on where, I saw behavior that I wouldn't have seen in a scripted meeting, but that I saw when I went to the office. And it was things like talking over, shutting down employees who were trying to contribute or add their 2 cents. That for me was an immediate, like, how can this person build, a cohesive team that works functionally well? When we invest, that leader has to scale. I don't have time to replace leaders. And then there was another story where there was this husband and wife team that had a really interesting tech. The husband was the tech lead. The wife was the business lead. And she was phenomenal at pitching the business. She knew everything cold, was great. But the problem was he was the CEO. She was not. And then when I dug into the cap structure and you looked at the equity balance, it was all him, not her. And so there was this whole weird power dynamic that I was like, you know what, it's not sitting right with me. And it's certainly not the value that I'm seeing from the team. And that has to be aligned. And I want everyone appropriately incentivized to do their job well. And so, that ended up being a pass for me because of, again, these more cultural, values things that I think are important in building strategic and strong teams.
So funny and coincidental. Earlier this week, I met with a founder, a husband and wife founding team, and they have a wonderful startup, a wonderful mission, but they've raised way too much capital, way too much, orders of magnitude too much, right? But he was like, oh, it's okay. The cap table's fine because I'm still in good shape. I've got this amount. And I said, well, what did your wife have? Oh, she's very low on the cap table. And it just struck me as weird. I mean, I guess you're a husband and wife, so does it matter? But it felt off to me to call yourselves co-founders, put yourselves on the slide, and then it's so out of balance.
Totally agree. And that's why I think it's important that, what people say and what they do have to align. And that I think that's an example of where you don't necessarily have alignment.
On today's special segment, we have Brian Hirsch of Tribeca Venture Partners. Brian, can you tell us a story about a good or a bad pass? A story about a startup that you passed on?
I could spend hours on this segment, just given how long I've been in the business now.
It's a fun
one.
But
I think the one that pops into my head, just I was reading about it recently, is actually not a New York company. It's a company in the state of Washington called Remitly. I don't know if you're familiar with Remitly.
Sure.
But it's a remittance business that was started by Matt Oppenheimer, and that's great. And this is one where it sort of ties into one of the failures I had in my career. A company called iCobo, which I did the Series A along with TTV Capital when I was running the Greenhill Fund, and so Remitly was a remittance business, and Matt, I first spoke to Matt. It's probably late 2010 or early 2011 when he was the head of mobile and internet banking initiatives at Barclays Bank in Kenya. So he was living in Kenya, and he really got to understand the remittance issues just generally through that role, and came up with the idea for Remitly. We spent some time talking. I talked to him in 2011. I talked to him again in 2012. I think even into 2013. So I probably had 3 different calendar years where we had conversations, and every time, I think I told them, I like him. I get the size of the market and the opportunity, but I was so burned from my own experience that I probably spent more of the time telling him that all the regulatory and legal issues he was going to have in his business, which is what we had at iCobo, versus focusing on the upside. And so this is like the classic issue. If you're someone like me that's been in the business long enough, is the scar tissue from money lost in a particular sector.
Right.
When the next company comes in that sector, it's really hard to kind of get through that scar tissue and swallow hard and make another investment in the sector. And so that's the one that has since gone on to raise, I don't know, $500 million. I think the last round earlier this summer was a $1.5 billion valuation. I think they're doing quite well as a company. So there's one I would have liked to back, not only because of the space is one I was familiar with and I knew was large. I really liked the entrepreneur. I just couldn't get out of my own way. And the story with iCobo was a sort of sort of an open loop remittance card, with a MasterCard. So what they did is they would allow a banked sender initially in the U.S. to send essentially what's like a prepaid card anywhere in the world. And so let's say you're an immigrant working at McKinsey and you have family back home in any country. Before iKobo, back in the day, you would send money via Zoom or maybe online if someone had a bank account, but really Western Union and MoneyGram. And that person would go, your loved one or relative would go and pick that money up, physically in a particular location. And some of those locations are not the safest locations because bad people know that that's where everyone goes to pick up the money from their family. And so not a great thing. And so what iKobo did is they would literally ship anywhere in the world these cards. And then now that loved one, instead of having to, leave their home and go to a potentially dangerous pickup location, they have a card that was instantly reloaded, online in seconds. And then that card could be used anywhere, MasterCard was taken, or you could use that card at an ATM and take out the cash. And the product was great. We just it was too soon post September 11th. And we just had a lot of regulatory issues around, KYC and AML that we thought we had buttoned up, but the government, there was a lot of fighting going on between who has jurisdiction, whether it's the federal government and the states, and it's created lots of issues for the company. And then the financial crisis hit, and we were done. And so I had that scar tissue, which is why when Remitly came along, I just couldn't pull the trigger.
That will conclude this installment of Investor Stories. If you're enjoying the program and would like to see it continue, take a moment and leave a 5-star review in iTunes. Also, if you'd like updates on new content from TFR, as well as the top 10 VC articles every week, go to fullratchet.net and sign up for the newsletter. Okay, that will wrap things up for today. Until next time, over-prepare, choose carefully, and invest confidently. Thanks for joining me.